Good evening. My name is Thomas Ridd. I'm a professor of strategic studies here at Johns Hopkins, and I'm the founding director of the Alperovitch Institute for Cybersecurity Studies. Okay, here's what will happen tonight. I will briefly introduce Dmitri Alperovitch. Then Dmitri will speak for approximately 30 to 40 minutes. Then we will have Dean Steinberg come on stage and have a conversation with Dmitri and a Q&A that we will then open up briefly for the audience. The event will conclude at approximately 6:30. Dmitri and I go back a little more than a decade. We remember because we both did something significant in our careers at the time. I published an academic article, as you would expect, I guess, and he exposed and attributed for the first time ever a Chinese industrial espionage campaign. At the time, it was around 2011, and that, I think, changed the entire conversation on hacking and cybersecurity. He then co-founded CrowdStrike in 2011 and built it up into one of the biggest, or perhaps even the biggest, depending on how you measure, cybersecurity companies in the United States or anywhere. In 2019, CrowdStrike's IPO valued the company at over 10 billion. Last year, I think it had 6,000 employees. Dmitri left CrowdStrike in early 2020. In that time, I had published maybe 2 more articles. But Dmitri was not just a spectacularly successful entrepreneur. He also was an authoritative and inquisitive, sought-after voice on all matters cybersecurity. And his core brand was attention to detail and range from the technical to the political, from the tactical to the strategic. It was really one of the few people in cybersecurity I remember who was able to talk about geopolitics as well as about reverse engineering. He coined the phrase that many of you will have heard before: we don't have a cyber problem, we have a China and a Russia problem, and variations of it. Dmitri soon reinvented himself with his trademark momentum as a philanthropist. He created a form of think tank, policy accelerator, Silverado, silverado.org, and together with Maureen Hinman, his wife, also supported Johns Hopkins SAIS to create the Alperovitch Institute, which opened in late 2021. This is a good moment also to mention that Dmitri and Maureen have created the Catherine Hinman Memorial Fellowship for students in financial need, students who do geopolitics, public policy, and if anybody's interested and needs financial support for an internship and beyond, go to silverado.org. The Alperovitch Institute has since created a second-to-none cybersecurity and technology policy curriculum here at SAIS. We have classes that are taught by some of the brightest and sharpest and most influential practitioners and analysts in this field. People from Mandiant, from Google, from Meta, soon Microsoft, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, from the intelligence community, and more. We're only at the beginning. Just past 2 weeks, we had 2 classes that I just want to briefly mention here. One on malware reverse engineering, an entire week of hands-on reversing on keyboard, and another one on signals intelligence development, SIGDEV, taught by a former senior GCHQ officer with participation by the former deputy director of the NSA. The institute, which bears Dmitri's name, reflects his range. Dmitri didn't just reinvent himself as a philanthropist, but also as a geopolitical thinker. His voice on great power competition, and specifically on Ukraine and Taiwan, has, as ever, the most impressive range and attention to detail. As those of you who follow him on Twitter or indeed listen to his podcast, Geopolitics Decanted, will appreciate. Lots of fresh voices that you may not have heard of before there. I always learn a great amount. Just 3 snippets. Dmitri recently debated John Mersheimer at an undisclosed location in Los Angeles. I heard that the professor didn't always look that great. Dmitri recently published Another Russia is Possible in Foreign Affairs, together with my esteemed SAIS colleague, Sergei Radchenko, who can't be here today. And he is currently writing a book on great power competition. I can't say more than that. That will, I'm sure, not just surprise us, but really grab us by the lapel. Dmitri, welcome on stage on lessons learned from the war in Ukraine, implications for Taiwan.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here at the Alperovitch Institute and SAIS. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Dean Steinberg, for inviting me here. So I want to give a talk on the lessons learned from the Ukraine war and the implications for Taiwan, but I do want to give a disclaimer that this war, I think, is still in its early innings. So this is a little bit like giving a lecture on the lessons learned from World War II in 1942. So with that disclaimer, I do think that there are certain things that we can deduce from the way the war has gone on and what that means for future conflicts, and particularly a conflict that hopefully will never take place. But unfortunately, I do believe the risk is very real this decade, and that is a conflict in the Indo-Pacific over Taiwan. But the reason why I think it's early to draw final conclusions about this war is that this is still a very dynamic battlefield. The outcome is still very uncertain. I think over the next couple of months, we're going to see some major offensives being conducted, likely by both sides. We will see what happens, but today it's really impossible to predict how this is going to unfold. I also think that this war is likely to go on for a very long time, in part because being a close watcher of Putin over the last two decades, I believe that he's fully committed to this fight. And the critical decision that he has made since launching the war was in late September, when he announced the annexations of these 4 oblasts, these 4 regions in Ukraine, and formally changed Russian constitution to accept them into Russia, even though he didn't fully control those territories, and since then, in fact, lost a great deal of land that he has annexed back in September. But that, I think, was a critical moment because it was an indication that he had effectively burned his bridges. He decided to signal to the elites in Russia and the Russian population that there's no going back. Now that you've declared that this is Russia, you can't just undo it and say, I was just kidding. And you have to keep moving forward. And he's bet his regime and perhaps even his life on the outcome of this war. And obviously, Ukrainians are fully committed to defending their land and liberty. So that is why I do think that this can go on for a while. But let's go through the lessons that I think we can deduce so far from this conflict. I have 15 that I want to go through, hopefully quickly, and get to the great discussion with the dean. But the first lesson is that history is back. Its death has been greatly exaggerated, and the wars of territorial conquest are certainly not obsolete, and it was foolish for anyone to think that they were. In fact, even just if you look at recent decades, we had a war in Iraq in 1990 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and attempted to annex it. That was a war of territorial conquest. 3 years ago, you had a war that few Americans paid too much attention to, but it was a very important conflict in the Caucasus, in Nagorno-Karabakh, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. There is a war of territorial conquest that Azerbaijan was trying to get this disputed territory from Armenia. So those conflicts happen, and it was, I think, important for all of us to appreciate that dictators and authoritarian regimes around the world have not lost their appetite for conquest and an appetite for annexing territory that they may have their sights on. But one thing that I think is important to look at is the causes for the war and what they may mean for a potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific. About 400 days ago, in December of 2021, I published a Twitter thread, which, Thomas, is a new way to publish peer-reviewed articles. But in that thread, I said that in the last few weeks, I have become increasingly convinced that Kremlin has unfortunately made a decision to invade Ukraine later that winter. So that was in December about 3 months before the actual invasion. So why was I so convinced back then that this invasion was likely to happen? Well, I looked at the landscape, and as I mentioned, I've been watching Putin and Russia very closely, having been born there. I understand the system quite well. And what I saw was an aging dictator that was determined to fix, quote unquote, fix an unsolved problem for him. This thorn on his side, Ukraine, that was increasingly being pulled into the Western orbit. So he was focused on, he saw the status quo changing. He saw Ukraine getting closer to the European Union, closer to NATO. Of course, promises had been made back in 2008 for Ukraine to join NATO. He also saw weaponry, Western weaponry, going into Ukraine, and saw the country pulling further and further away from Russian sphere of influence. He was also obsessed with his legacy and his place in history. Like many people, he's been obsessed with making his country great again and restoring its power and its prestige around the world. That's been his singular focus since coming to power in 1999. He was also discounting the pain that the country would suffer from economic sanctions. In fact, we know now that there have been a few people, including his central bank governor, a really capable individual, Elvira Nabiulina, who had come to him prior to the war with concerns that he may indeed invade Ukraine, and urged him not to do so, and talked about the dire circumstances that Russia would face if they had taken that step. And by the way, the same type of approach had been made to him in 2014, right before he annexed Crimea. And basically, in both cases, he had told them, reportedly, that it is your job to make sure that you mitigate those consequences. And I'm going to do what's right for Russia, and your job is to make sure that we don't suffer the pain for it. So he did not believe that Europe and the United States would be united in setting up these export controls and sanctions against Russia, or to the extent that those things would go into place, that it would have a significant impact on Russia. And in part, he may have been right, as I'll talk in a little bit. He also thought his military obviously was strong enough to execute a rapid regime change operation, and he thought that the population of the nation that he was invading would not put up major resistance. And he was surrounded mostly by yes men who did not contradict him and would not stand up and urge him to try to stop it or convince him to abandon this idea, particularly people in the military and the security services. So when I look at all those factors, and when I did look at them in December, I came to the conclusion, including looking at the military buildup that was taking place on Ukrainian borders, that we were very likely to have this invasion. And when you apply those factors to another dictator in another big country in Asia, many of the same, if not all, factors hold true today. I believe that President Xi is intent on bringing Taiwan into Chinese orbit, and that he wants to do that before he leaves office, either carried out or leaves voluntarily. And given that he's going to be 70 this year, there's probably a decade or so that's left from a practical life expectancy perspective for him to do so. So this is going to be a very, very dangerous decade indeed. Lesson 2, and we're starting to see this, is that major power wars can last a very long time. World War II lasted 6 years. World War I lasted 4 years. War in Korea lasted 3 years. You know, we're just about to get to 1-year anniversary of this war, and there's no indication that it's going to subside, as I mentioned. The other lesson I think that's important, and sometimes we lose sight of this looking at the day-to-day coverage of the war in the media, is that conventional miracle weapons don't really exist. I was just giving an interview to a reporter about this, and he was pressuring me. Which weapon had the most effect in Ukraine? Is it the HIMARS? Is it the TB2 drones? And my answer to that reporter was that it was there was one miracle weapon, and it was called Russian stupidity. That in every stage of this conflict, and there have been pretty much 3 major battles that have taken place since the war began: the Battle of Kiev, the attempt by Russia to invade and surround Kiev, which the Ukrainians won; the battle for Kharkiv and the counteroffensives that the Ukrainians had conducted to take back the territory, and then the Battle of Kherson, where they also succeeded. All three of those were mostly, the Ukrainian victory in those conflicts was mostly caused by Russian incompetence in all three cases, and happy to elaborate later on why. But the other lesson here is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. This has been primarily a war of artillery on both sides, enormous amount of munitions being expended. It's been a war of armor, it's been a war of infantry, so in some of the same ways that we've seen conflicts unfold since World War I, we have seen the same things take place on the battlefield. And yes, TB2 drones had been initially very helpful to the Ukrainians in taking out Russian armor, in some cases Russian naval capabilities in the Black Sea, but the Russians had adapted to that. You're not seeing a lot of TB2 strike videos lately, and there's a reason for that, using electronic warfare, using other mechanisms, they've countered that threat. Commercial drones, same thing. You've been seeing a lot of videos of drones, cheap drones from China that are dropping grenades on trenches on both sides of the conflict, becoming a lot less effective because of the increased electronic warfare being used by both sides. Even the HIMARS weapons, which probably did have the most significant effects so far on the conflict, you're seeing the Russians adapt to those long-range multiple launch rocket systems by moving their artillery depots out the side of the range of those weapons. So every weapon that you bring to the battlefield can have an immediate effect, but very quickly the other side will adapt and respond to it. But one thing that's really clear is that volume matters more than individual weapons. When you look at both the number of artillery shells that are being fired by both sides in the thousands every single day, when you look at the amount of tanks and other armored vehicles that have been destroyed, about 5,500 combined, both Ukrainian and Russian, just massive, massive volumes. And one of the lessons I think we need to draw from this is that if we are going to be engaged in a major power war, or even supporting a small power like Ukraine, fighting a major power, we need to massively build up our defense industrial base. Right now, we're producing about the same number of artillery shells every single month that the Ukrainians are consuming in less than a week. That is not sustainable, particularly if this war goes on for years. We're already at limits in terms of what we can give them from our stockpiles. We need to massively ramp up. If there's, God forbid, a war over Taiwan, we may expend all of our missiles, long-range missiles, within a week of that conflict. Imagine if it goes on for years. We just do not have the defense industrial base capacity to keep up with the munition rate of fire that these wars may expect. Another lesson from this war is the importance of combined arms warfare. And both sides in this conflict have not been able to execute great combined arms operations. The Russians in particular have failed miserably on several counts, and perhaps most importantly, in the case of air power. The Russians have not been able to establish air dominance over Ukraine, and that has made all the difference. It has allowed the Ukrainians to push back. It has allowed them to set up their HIMARS systems, 50 kilometers from the front lines, without fear of them being targeted by the Russians, and execute these daring attacks against arms depots and troop concentrations that have been very effective. One question, though, if you think about the conflict in Asia, is how good is China at combined arms? They have not trained for it at a significant extent. They've had issues with corruption similar to Russia, and it's a real question about their ability to execute successful operations. But on the other hand, the same questions could be raised about Taiwan. In fact, even more so. Right now, when you look at the conscription in Taiwan that lasts about 4 months that they're extending, they fire a rifle about 3 times and spend the rest of the time cleaning their barracks. I question the efficacy of those activities to warfare. And it's really important to emphasize the lesson of training. The US military is one of the few militaries in the world that trains like it fights, and spends an inordinate amount of time training in realistic scenarios. We're now seeing that doing parade ground showings like the Russians have been doing over the last couple of decades does not create a capable fighting force. And that has potentially good news for us when it comes to China. But it also emphasizes this war, the importance of full-range spectrum capabilities. When you look at Russia, they were good at certain things, but there's so many things that they weren't capable of doing, like the suppression of enemy air defenses, for example, to be able to take out the air defense systems, both the Soviet ones and now the new Western ones that are coming into the country. If they had that, that could have made all the difference in this conflict. If they had long-range ISR and strike capabilities, they could have hit the supply lines of weapons and other supplies coming in through Poland. They didn't have that, and that is causing them massive problems. China is not great at this either. And in fact, when you look at their training, if they're going to be successful at invading Taiwan, they're probably going to have to conduct an airborne assault on critical facilities on the island, including ports and government institutions. They have not practiced for those operations. They're really, really complicated. So how good are they going to be when the order is given? I want to mention quickly cyber. We have not seen a lot of cyber activity that has been effective in Ukraine. We have seen a lot of cyber activity, it's just not been effective. But perhaps one of the most effective cyber operations we've ever seen in the military context was the operation that the Russians unleashed in the early hours of the war against an American company called Viasat that provides satellite communications, including to Ukrainian military. And by hacking that company and distributing a malicious update to modems located in Ukraine, they were able to destroy Ukrainians' ability to communicate via satellites. And then, because they were using cyber in a combined arms operation, engaging both electronic warfare to shut down radio communications and doing kinetic strikes against critical communications nodes in the first hours of the war, they were able to achieve an incredible effect of essentially blinding the Ukrainians and preventing them from communicating with their frontline units. And if you remember, in those first 48 hours of the war, the Russians had made enormous gains. They had captured about 30% of the country, the entire south, effectively coming up from Crimea. They had gotten all the way to Kiev in those initial hours. And then, thanks to, in part to Elon Musk and other things, the Ukrainians were able to rebuild their communications and put up a very fierce defense that ultimately turned the tide and made the Russians lose. But cyber unequivocally contributed to that early success. That was really important. And what you've seen since then is a variety of cyber attacks that the Russians had been launching against Ukrainian critical infrastructure, their energy sector, their financial sector, their railways, but they have not been using that in conjunction with a full combined arms operation. So as one-offs, they've been very ineffective because the Ukrainians have built a lot of resiliency into their networks. They've been able to rebuild them quickly, and even though they've been experiencing temporary outages, the Russians have not been able to leverage that for any strategic effect. So cyber is important. It is not decisive, but the critical piece about cyber is to use it in combination with other tactics, electronic warfare, kinetic strikes, etc., to achieve strategic effects. And by the way, one other thing that's really important about the Viasat hack is the psychological impact of that operation, because it's not just about blinding the enemy communications and preventing them from organizing a capable defense, but in those early days, talking to the Ukrainians, both civilian and military people on the ground, there was a lot of panic. There was a lot of misinformation, partly misinformation that the Russians were propagating, that units have been surrendering, that people weren't fighting, that Zelensky had fled, and preventing people from communicating and getting the real story was really, really effective for the Russians in those early days. One other piece about cyber that I think is worth mentioning is that what you're seeing in Ukraine may not necessarily translate to what you might see in a conflict over Taiwan. And that's because both militaries, the United States military and the Chinese military that might be involved in that conflict, are both using now highly advanced weapon systems that are networked, that are much more vulnerable to cyber operations. So, for example, the F-35 is basically a computer with wings, and is highly dependent on enormous software infrastructure on the ground, a lot of it connected to the internet, on sensitive networks, but not classified networks. and targeting those systems can impact logistics of the F-35, can impact its readiness, can impact its operational capability. So those are the types of things that you might see unfold in a conflict in Asia that we have not seen in Ukraine, primarily because both militaries are fighting mostly with old Soviet weapons that don't even have chips in them, much less any network connectivity. A couple of other lessons that I think are really important. The operational security and the information warfare is becoming essential in modern conflict, and that is where the Ukrainians have been winning since day one, hands down. OPSEC in particular has been astonishing to watch because here they have hundreds of thousands of people that they mobilized, a lot of them with no military expertise, and yet you're seeing very few videos on social media, unlike the Russian side, of troops showing off what they're doing, of them revealing their locations. You've seen a lot of that on the side of the Russians, not so much on the Ukrainians. So that's been really remarkable and something that, frankly, no military has been able to achieve. I mean, if you look at the US military, you've seen soldiers post all kinds of things on Facebook that reveal operational details. But the information warfare has been incredible to watch. The Ukrainians have engaged in incredible propaganda campaign that's been very successful at mobilizing Western support and, in fact, beefing up people's belief that they can win this war. I'll just mention quickly two examples of that. The famous Ghost of Kiev story, where you had this mythical Ukrainian fighter pilot that if you aggregate all the accounts of his victories in the early stages of the war, you'd think that he had shot down the entire Russian Air Force all by himself. A couple months later, the Ukrainians admitted that he actually never existed. And then when I talked to people on the ground, Western analysts that have been on the ground and talked to Ukrainian pilots, there's not been actually a single recorded hit of an air-to-air kill of a Ukrainian jet killing a Russian jet. There have been lots of kills through air defense systems, but not an air-to-air kill in combat. So incredible story that they invented just out of thin air that a lot of people bought in those early days. Snake Island, you may recall, this island that was surrounded by the Russian ship and told famously the Russian ship to blank off. And the initial story was that all of the defenders fought valiantly and perished in that fight. We found out later that they surrendered and were exchanged in a prisoner exchange later on. But one question I do have, though, is how good is Taiwan going to be in this type of conflict? How good are they going to be at mobilizing the Western opinion and putting out all these incredible memes that the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is cranking out on Twitter? I have my doubts about their capabilities there. A few more points. Gradual escalation by Western powers to provide weapons to Ukraine has been frustrating to many and has no doubt resulted in loss of Ukrainian lives, probably hundreds if not thousands of them. However, I believe it's been essential to avoid a conflict. If you look at all the weapons we've provided to Ukraine, we now have Patriot missiles going in. We have M1 Abrams tanks that will probably go in a year or so. We have Bradley armored fighting vehicles, HIMARS, and so forth. If we had given that all to Ukraine in the first month of the war, we would have probably forced Putin to respond and retaliate. But by slowly boiling the frog, we've sort of never given them an opportunity to respond to significant escalation by slow rolling those weapons. So it has had a cost, no doubt, cost in lives, but I think it was a really important strategic decision by the administration that likely avoided a broader NATO-Russia conflict. Another point is that deterrence works. So both Russia and the West have been deterred because both sides, of course, possess nuclear weapons, and we've been able to avoid escalation. But of course, it doesn't feel good because a lot of people want to do more to help Ukraine. You may remember there have been calls to close the airspace in Ukraine, essentially do combat air patrols in the Ukrainian airspace, and so forth. That would have been highly, highly escalatory. We didn't do it because we were deterred in part by Russian nuclear weapons from doing those sorts of things. It feels horrible because we can't do more to help them. But on the other hand, it is also deterring the Russians, and that's what ultimately deterrence is supposed to do. Ironically, I think the Chinese may draw the wrong lessons from this, because they may think that looking at what's happening in this conflict, because the United States is not intervening directly with our troops and our personnel to help Ukraine, and we're being deterred by Russian nuclear weapons, that we would also be deterred from helping Taiwan in that conflict. I think that would be a dangerous miscalculation, but they may very well draw that conclusion. Land-based supply chains have also been essential. If there was no Poland or Slovakia through which we're supplying weapons to Ukraine, Ukraine would not have been able to sustain their combat for this long. And of course, Taiwan is an island. There is no Poland next to it. And resupplying Taiwan with munitions, with food and energy that they're going to need for a prolonged conflict is going to be extremely difficult, which is why they need to be doing more to build up their own supplies, build out their own domestic defense production industry to make sure that they can sustain a conflict for a long time in case we're not able to get to them quickly. Limits of sanctions and export controls is worth talking to. At Silverado, we just put out a report last week analyzing the impact of export controls and sanctions on Russian economy. And what we found is that there's been a cost, that goods flowing into Russia have not stopped, but the Russians are paying more for them, and certain goods are hard to get in large quantities, but nevertheless, they're working around it. In fact, I was talking recently to a senior European official who was vacationing in Turkey and was staying at a hotel where a bunch of Russian Duma folks and oligarchs were staying, and he was at the breakfast buffet and was asking him, well, how are things going with the economy, how are things affecting you personally? Of course, this is a very rich population that he was encountering, not representative of a typical Russian, but they said, you know, the most impactful thing for us has been the fact that we can no longer send our kids to study in London. And then he said, well, what about the sanctions and export controls? Can you still get all the goods that you need? And they said, oh, absolutely. We just need, if we pay 20% more, we can get anything we want. And we found that to be pretty much true. A lot of transshipments now happening through former Soviet states, through Turkey, Armenia, for example. There's a remarkable graph in our report that shows imports of cell phones into Armenia. And as you can imagine, Armenia is a small country, pretty much a steady import of cell phones. The war happens, massive spike of imports in cell phones. And then we look at exports of cell phones from Armenia into Russia. Pretty much none, as you might imagine. Armenia is not a big producer of cell phones. To Russia, war happens, massive spike, identical to the imports going into Russia. So they're able to work around it, but obviously at a cost. Logistics. As the saying goes, the amateurs talk strategy and professionals talk logistics. Both sides have been challenged by logistics, although the Ukrainians have done an incredible job managing what is essentially a Noah's Ark of weapon systems, right? They've got two of each kind of everything imaginable, and managing the repair, managing the maintenance of those systems. They've done an incredible job. But in the Pacific, all sides, China, U.S., Taiwan, will be extremely challenged in that environment to resupply their forces. Pacific is a huge place, as you all know. And then final lesson is that quantity does have a quality of its own. So there's been a lot of derogatory information out there in the initial weeks after Putin mobilized 300,000 personnel, people saying that these people are not going to be trained well, they're not going to be able to succeed in holding ground. Well, we've seen quite the opposite, that even though many of those people have been untrained, and in fact some of them have been convicts, that Prigozhin, this head of paramilitary group Wagner, has been recruiting from Russian prisons. He's thrown them at places like Bakhmut, he's thrown them at places like Soledar, and they've gained ground. They've lost a lot of people, not that they care, but at the end of the day, numbers do matter. And we're seeing that the Russians have been able to stabilize their front line because of the numbers of people they mobilized. And actually, over the last couple of months, they've been able to train them up extensively. And when you look at the numbers in Asia, PLA, 2.5 million people, the numbers do matter. Now, numbers can matter on the other side too. And I believe that there's only one country in the world that can ultimately deter an invasion of Taiwan, and that country is Taiwan, not the United States. And when you look at Taiwan, a country of 25 million people, about 5 to 6 million military-age males, if they actually do what Finland does, what Israel does, which is real conscription, at least a year, maybe even 2, real training, you put 5 million people under arms, and the invasion becomes an impossibility. That's 2.5 size of the entire PLA force. So that is going to be the most significant thing that Taiwan can do to make sure that they keep their freedom and de facto independence. And the last point I will make, this is not a lesson, but there's been a lot of articles that are being written right now about the need to negotiate, that this war, prolonged war, may not be in the United States' interest, that the risk of escalation may grow, although I don't agree with that. My personal view on that is that you cannot negotiate when neither sides are interested in negotiating, and when both sides still believe that they can win. And there's clear belief on the Ukrainian side that they can still take back all of their territory, and there's a belief in Moscow that they can accomplish most of the objectives that they set out to do. And until one or both of those sides get disillusioned with that prospect, negotiations are going to go absolutely nowhere, and you cannot have negotiations in that context. So perhaps this war will end in negotiations. After all, most wars do, but the time is certainly not right today to hold those negotiations, and we have to see how those offensives over the coming months play out, and potentially further offensives after that. But one or both sides will have to realize that they can no longer achieve their objectives on the battlefield before you can have any sort of meaningful negotiations take place. So with that, I've spoken for way too long, but thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion with the dean.
That was a tour de force. Thank you. That was really fantastic. And I know we have a lot of students here, and I'm sure they were taking notes, and some of this will get translated into my class that I'm teaching on Monday. So, and some of them are really directly related to some of the themes that we're looking at here on so many of the classes here at SAIS. So thank you for that. And there's so much that I want to ask you about and drill down on. But let me just pick up on a couple of things and start where you started, at sort of at the strategic level. You talked about history. And one of the things that, for those of us who bring both kind of a perspective of practice but also of history to this, sort of looks at this and says, well, as you pointed out, the motivations for the war here are multiple, right? But they're deeply rooted in this kind of revanchist dimension that is more than just achieving access to resources or even finding strategic depth. It's about a deep historical narrative that goes to, in the case of Russia, Kiev Rus, in the case of China, to the Ming and Qing dynasties control in the Chinese narrative over Taiwan, and in both cases the idea that external forces took it away. And so when you have a situation like this, putting your strategist point of view, the normal considerations, the kind of rational actor thing that says, well, people won't fight if they think the cost is too high. When it comes down to these deep-seated things, I mean, how do you interact with that in a way that is meaningful in dissuading a Putin or Xi, given those narratives, that somehow they nonetheless shouldn't do it? So it goes to your point about deterrence, goes to thinking about how for them, the value of succeeding and the cost of not even trying, not just succeeding, but not even trying, is enormously high.
Wow, that's a great question. And I think the answer is that you have to try early and try often. And I was having conversation with very senior officials in the White House in the lead up to the war. You may remember when there were talks in Geneva a month before the invasion. And we're talking about what you could do, what you could offer Russians to potentially thwart this action. And at that point, it was too late. They had built up the forces. For him to pull back would have taken enormous concessions that we would have never given him. But if you had started a year in advance, before you had a major built-up of forces, if you had tried to figure out some sort of accommodation, you could have potentially avoided conflict. I don't think it was inevitable. But clearly, at some point down the line, he decided, and I think most wars, by the way, I think get started with a gut reaction. I don't think most people write pros and cons list and figure out, is this the right thing to do? You sort of decide that I want to do this, and then you sort of justify it with a million reasons for why it's the right thing to do. But clearly, a conflict over Taiwan is not inevitable, and there's more we can do to dissuade the Chinese, both through deterrence, military buildup. I think a lot of what the administration is doing right now with tech policy, making sure that the Chinese remain reliant on us for critical materials like chips, is going to be vital to making them realize that the cost of this is going to be high, but also finding ways to potentially be more accommodating. They very much care about the one China policy, so convincing them that we have no intention to allow Taiwan to proclaim independence is also going to be very important.
Excellent. So let me then ask about, you talked about both similarities and differences, and for all of us, one of the striking ones is the point you focused on towards the end, which is the land access to Ukraine and the fact that Taiwan is an island. And when we think about both the problem but also the strategy, right, that it wasn't open to Putin to isolate Ukraine, to surround Ukraine, to blockade Ukraine. But clearly, as people think about this, there's an option for China to invade. But the resonance of Berlin, for many of us, is strong here in terms of thinking about the challenge. And you mentioned the idea of fortification and for stockpiling, but you also focused on the idea that this is could be a long-term thing. I mean, and so how do we think about this? I mean, can you rerun the Berlin airlift? I mean, why wouldn't, for the Chinese, thinking about all the other things that I'm going to ask you about in a minute, wouldn't this look like the things that they would do? And is it plausible to think that, or what would a strategy look like over not just the first weeks or months to deal with that kind of challenge, but over a long term?
So there are people in the community that believe that China will not invade, but they'll launch a blockade. If they do so, I think it will be an enormous mistake for them, because we do have the capabilities to run that blockade. And if they're not going to be ready to follow that on with an invasion, they're going to lose. And their capabilities in anti-submarine warfare, for example, are very much lacking. We have enormous assets in the region. We're getting more through allies like Australia. They're getting nuclear-powered submarines from us, although they may not come until after the war is over, given the current timeline. In fact, having a conversation with a senior Australian official, they said that we realize we're buying a post-war fleet. But nevertheless, what you look at what Japan is doing with the reforming of their security policy and their military buildup, I don't think the Chinese will be able to sustain a blockade over Taiwan. And they're also going to face enormous criticism, because if you're actually preventing food and energy from going in, you're going to cause an enormous humanitarian crisis on the island. They're going to lose any friends that they might even have over that. So, a blockade may be an initial element of invasion, but they have to be ready to invade. And by the way, as we saw with the Russian buildup over Ukraine invasion, you're going to need months of preparation, months of buildup of ships and armor and infantry that you're going to carry across the straits, and we're going to see that. So we're going to be prepared for it. So I don't think that a blockade really answers any of the problems that they want to answer.
Let me just stay on this for a second, because one of the arguments you made against it is that we could run the blockade, but that assumes that they wouldn't take measures against us. And so it goes to your point, and your point about deterrence, right? Which is that, in the Ukraine conflict, we have done everything we can to avoid any risk of U.S. casualties, right? I mean, it has been the dominant feature of the strategy, and everything else has flown from the starting point being, how do we make sure? But if we get into the business of having to run the blockade, right, can we assume that the Chinese wouldn't use force against our forces? And how much of the strategy then does depend on how deterred we will or won't be in this situation? That's the first part, right? And the second part is, can we, if it gets to an invasion, as you suggest, can we successfully resist an invasion without kinetic attacks on the Chinese mainland and the sources of it, and then talk about the escalation theory? Because as you said, the whole thing has been around non-escalation. Is it possible to imagine in the Taiwan situation, either in the blockade scenario or the invasion scenario, that we can avoid the risk on either side, that they attack US forces, not just Taiwan, and or that we feel obliged to attack the mainland and China?
So make no mistake, when I talk about running the blockade, I fully expect that the risk is high that the Chinese would engage and will be in a conflict with them as a result. The difference between Ukraine and Taiwan is frankly that Taiwan is strategic to U.S. interests and Ukraine is not. And you've seen the President Biden articulate this indirectly over the course of last year when he has made it very clear in the lead up to the war and since that we will not send American troops to die for Ukraine, but he has said on 4 occasions now that we will defend Taiwan if it's invaded.
But he says we'll defend, but defend is different than saying we'll send American troops. I mean, defend could mean a lot of different things, but keep going.
It can, but I think the assumption certainly is in the U.S. military and in the White House that we will fight a war over Taiwan because we believe that Taiwan is strategic to U.S. interests, that allowing China to break through the first island chain where we essentially have them contained and letting them essentially turn what is now a U.S. Navy lake, the Pacific Ocean, into a contested ground is really, really bad for U.S. national security. I think it's disputable whether that is the case or not, but the assumption going in is that we cannot afford to lose Taiwan. And that changes everything from our ability to defend Japan, Philippines, etc. I have my doubts, to be honest with you, about whether that is the case. I think it would unquestionably make it more difficult for us, but perhaps not existential. Time will tell.
But just stay on this because I also want to come back to the Biden comments. But still, we still have the situation. Okay, even if we accept the idea that the U.S. would take casualties, is it possible to succeed in a conflict without using force against the Chinese mainland? And what are because we haven't done that against Russia, right, in Ukraine, either by proxy or ourselves, right?
So that's a great question. And in fact, when you look at the war games that are being run, in almost every war game, the military would go to the president and ask for permission to hit air bases on the mainland, because without hitting those air bases, you lose probably tens of thousands of Americans, and many ships will be sunk, and so forth. The Chinese may give us that option for free by targeting our own bases preemptively in Guam or in Japan, in which case we're all in and we're striking back. But if that does not happen, I don't think that most presidents would choose to escalate to the mainland, even knowing the cost of not doing so, because you hit the mainland, our mainland gets hit. Not necessarily with nuclear weapons, but even conventional strikes are highly escalatory, and who knows where things go from there.
So clearly one of the big conundrums about this, because if we don't, as you say, casualties are high and the near-term resolution of the conflict becomes more difficult.
It's ugly.
So the other piece that you touched on there, and thinking again about the Taiwan scenario, is the information warfare and the network warfare side of this. And you pointed out, which I think many of us appreciate, is how important this is to both of our sides. So the obvious place that people will think about going is obviously what happened cyber in the example you described with the satellites and the like, but also could happen kinetically. And so how does that fit in terms of the managing this crisis, the escalation risks and stuff? Is it imaginable that once we get into the scenario you're talking about, where actually Chinese and American lives are losing, that the satellite constellations wouldn't go out? And how does that story play out in the context of the Taiwan?
So that's a great question. One of the other big problems with Taiwan being an island is that maybe a physical blockade of the island would not succeed, but an information blockade might, because the way that Taiwan gets most of its internet connectivity today is through underwater sea cables that could get cut in the first hours of the conflict. They're so close to Taiwanese mainland that executing electronic warfare against the island and jamming their radio communications is going to be significantly much easier, and they would be able to achieve what the Russians have not been able to achieve over Ukraine because of the large landmass that you're dealing with there. But I've had this conversation with senior Taiwanese officials, and this was in early September before some of the news came out about Starlink being potentially impeded by Elon Musk on the front lines in Ukraine, and there was discussion about should they invest in Starlink capability. And they actually brought up an interesting point that I was not considering at the time, that Elon has so many business interests in China with factories and what have you, that would he turn it off if they were using it in a case of conflict? And certainly we've seen some erratic behavior emerge from him since then that suggests that it might. So that is, I think, an enormous, complicated issue for the Taiwanese. They need to invest in some capabilities, short-range frequency communications capabilities that would be harder to jam, frequency hopping, et cetera, to make sure that, one, they could just even communicate with the outside. If you think about the best weapons that the Ukrainians have had since the war began, it's been Vladimir Zelensky, being able to get on television, being able to browbeat countries into supplying aid, shame them, et cetera. If the Taiwanese are not able to do that and cannot mobilize a coalition of Western countries to help them, that's going to be incredibly impactful to their ability to defend themselves. So that is, I think, a major advantage that the Chinese would have in this conflict.
Another point you touched on was the training and preparation issue. And having spent a fair amount of Taiwan, I think your description of both the training regime and the capacity is pretty spot on, right? But here's the dilemma.
I should mention the professional military is better trained,
of course,
but they're small.
But they're very small, and as you say, I mean, and it is obviously deeply contentious in Taiwan for reasons that is often true in these situations. But one in particular I want you to focus on is that, you know, the very act of deciding to do that, right? It's always the dilemma, because you pointed out about the one China policy and Taiwan not becoming independent, but to the extent that the Taiwanese were willing to do that and do the things that you think are necessary, and certainly everybody in our military thinks is necessary, doesn't that look to China like the prelude to independence and what you would do if you were determined to do that, which is to put yourself in a position to do this? And how do you avoid this sort of trap of, on the one hand, needing to strengthen their capacity to defend, but on the other hand, not triggering the view in Beijing that time is not on their side, that, as you pointed out with Ukraine, the sense that Putin had of that they was losing Ukraine, that they were coming closer to the West, that even if the things don't look great, that they'll only look worse in the future, and therefore, from the Chinese point of view, you might as well go sooner rather than later.
So I think that the folks sitting in Beijing right now have already made that calculation, because they appreciate now that a political reunification is not possible, that no one in Taiwan, certainly not after seeing what happens in Hong Kong or Xinjiang, et cetera, is interested in joining the mainland and becoming part of China. So they're, I think, getting more and more realistic that the only solution, if they want reunification, is going to be a military solution. And frankly, they're going to go when they want to go and when they're ready to go. And I don't believe they're ready today. So some of the same arguments have been made prior to the war, in the years in the lead up to the war over Ukraine, that we should not be supplying weapons to Ukraine because it's going to trigger an invasion. Well, the invasion happened anyway, and the Ukrainians weren't ready. Thank God that we at least helped them with some level of training, some weapons, or it could have gotten, really, really bad for them. So I think if you start with the premise that the Chinese are committed to reunification, which they clearly communicated that they are, and that they're starting to appreciate that reunification will not happen peacefully, thus the military option is very likely to be used at some point. You want to train Taiwan to be best ready for it.
I got to say, that sounds not necessarily consistent with your earlier observation that war is not inevitable. It sounds to me that logic...
Well, it's not inevitable if you deter them, absolutely, if they think that they cannot succeed.
That's the question, is whether they have to try. Turning back to sort of the Ukraine situation. So you talked about the negotiations, and I think you're right. I mean, but we also have a lot of examples of conflicts, and you mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh for one. You could even think about Korea for others, but there are a lot of frozen conflicts out there that are not where you haven't got a peace treaty, but the war has paused, and often paused for an extended period of time. So I guess my question to you is, one, can you imagine, or two, do you think it's likely that we would reach a point where neither side clearly agrees that this is over, and each side will be thinking about preparing it, but that we move from this really horrible, level of conflict now to more of one of these frozen conflict states?
I think it's very possible, and the key thing to watch is actually the capacity of either side to keep prosecuting this war with the level of intensity that you have now. So there's a lot of talk about Russians potentially running low on ammunition supplies, and Russia being artillery-heavy military. Ammunition for artillery systems is absolutely vital for them. So there's allegations that the administration has made that they've gotten some artillery shells from North Korea. We know that they've raided supplies in Belarus. We don't know how long that's going to last. They're trying to build up their own industrial capacity to produce them, but they won't be able to keep up with the rate at which they're expending them today. So if they run out, or if the Ukrainians run out, because we also don't have big supplies to send them, that could make a huge difference and could potentially lead us to less intense battlefield. And after all, I wouldn't call what's been happening since 2014 a frozen conflict, because you had active combat on a daily basis for the last 9 years taking place in Ukraine, but you could get to that level of warfare over time. I still think that neither side will be content with that, and will try to rebuild, reconstitute forces, and go again, and try to succeed. So it's not going to be a permanent solution by any means.
All right, so I could keep on going, but let me turn a little bit to the audience here and give you all a chance to ask some questions, and I'm going to want to try to start with some of our students, if we could. Let me see. Yeah, in the back, please. And there are microphones, I believe, yes, somewhere that are coming to you. Yes.
Right there in the back.
Yep. Yes, for sure. Never mind, students. You always let another dean ask a question. Paul, please. And welcome.
Thank you. And I'm sitting in back not because I'm avoiding the front, but because we have COVID paranoia at my house. So anyway, fascinating talk. I think I agree with 90 or 95%, and I could spend the rest of the evening on the other 5%. But let me just ask a hopefully simple question, keying off of what Jim asked you about Berlin. We never were able to defeat a Soviet conventional attack on Berlin, and yet we deterred one. And you could say, well, that's because we had a nuclear monopoly. Well, we continued to deter it even long after that monopoly went away. And arguably, it wasn't until Khrushchev in 1962 attempted to change the nuclear balance globally that the Berlin crisis subsided. It seems to me that the evidence is really pretty strong, and I'm going to go to South Korea now, that Stalin only finally gave permission to Kim Il-sung to invade in 1949 after he saw the Americans abandon China without a whimper. And the analogy today with Afghanistan is rather disturbing. But on the very important side, when people nip at Biden's heels for saying 4 or 5 times, we will help defend Ukraine, help defend Taiwan. And he doesn't say specifically how, but it's pretty clear that he couldn't say that without meaning with Americans there. And they say, well, then the staff immediately walks it back by saying the one China policy hasn't changed. I've spent many years in the government debating how many angels are on the head of that pin with Chinese and with Taiwanese and at the Congress. And I believe that Biden has it right and his critics have it wrong. But the most important thing I would say, apart from that semi-theological argument, Biden never said about Taiwan what he did with Ukraine, which is what we will not do. And if I were in Beijing advising Xi Jinping and with the guts to tell him what he doesn't want to hear, and nobody there does have that, I would point out the president said it 4 or 5 times, and he never said what we will not do. You better count on the Americans getting involved, and I'm not sure we will be, but I hope that gives them pause. Thank you.
I think that's right, and I think that in one of those interviews, he was asked directly, actually, would you send American troops to fight? And he said yes.
I'm not so sure he did.
I'll have to
We
check.
can look that one up, but
I'll have to check.
I think, I don't think he quite went that
But you know, the circumstances around which an invasion happens matter a great deal. You know, if the Taiwanese do not fight, for example, and I think they will, but if they don't, you know, we're not fighting back to retake the island, right? That's not going to happen. If they fall within the first couple of weeks, there's not going to be a lot that we could do to help them because we're too far. So how it unfolds matters a great deal, and you know, frankly, making a blanket statement that we will do that may be counterproductive, because I don't think any U.S. president will send American troops to fight for a country that will not fight for itself.
That's a fair point. Right here. If you don't mind, it's always a little bit easier since we have these nice people handing out the mics.
Rena Rakipi here. Thank you for the discussion, Mr. Alperovitch. So my question is regarding the capabilities, and I do believe that capabilities do serve as a deterrent towards the beginning of war, specifically U.S.-China for Taiwan. I do believe that we have supremacy in a lot of regards, except for one that I think China might rival us in. So I'm curious to your opinions on the developments of quantum computational abilities. I know we were discussing communications being kind of the one of the largest factors towards the partial success of Russia in the beginning of the Ukrainian war, and then we kind of gained some traction back. So what are your thoughts on, again, the development of quantum technologies on China's side, their utilization of quantum satellites for communications, and how that might kind of trigger the potential start, that kind of moment where they want to engage?
Okay, so a couple things here. So quantum computing and quantum communications are two completely different things that have nothing to do with each other whatsoever. And the fact that the Chinese have been able to send some photons from satellites that you can't intercept without changing it and showing them that it's been messed with is really a gimmick, and is not a capability that anyone really cares much about. Quantum computing, I think, will come at some point, but I'm quite confident it will not come in the next 15 years, which is, I think, the window in which we face the most danger from invasion. So I don't think that it's going to have any implication whatsoever for this conflict.
Okay, right here.
Hi there, I'm Connor O'Brien. I'm an alum. You talked about the Biden administration spreading out the timeline of the weapon systems that it sends to Ukraine, and that was the right call, even though it was a difficult one, because that would avoid Russian escalation. I'm curious if you could kind of expand on that. Do you think that the Russians would have attacked NATO as a result? I'm kind of curious what that escalation looks like. Thank you.
I do. I think they have a variety of options to both do covert operations in Poland against depots where the equipment is being gathered, or ports. They can do missile strikes against those facilities as an initial escalation. And I'll tell you, there's great concern in the Pentagon and the administration that if certain weapons are provided, that we're going to see such escalation. And I don't think it's without basis. So I think it's been really important to walk carefully into this. Putin does not want a conflict with NATO, but he may be forced to get into one if he feels like he's losing face and things are changing dramatically on the ground. And by, again, slowly boiling the frog, I think we've successfully so far avoided that escalation.
Right. Okay, right here.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. One thing that would be pretty useful would be for us to realize that that invasion force will be made up of only children. That is to say, they have no brothers and sisters. And I'm sure every Chinese would love to take over Taiwan. But at some point, you realize, yeah, I want Taiwan, but not if it means losing my only kid. That kind of thing is what should be broadcast into China. And so I have to ask about the astonishing failure of our own cyber operations, our own attempt to break the Communist Party's great censorship wall. Why are we not doing what we effectively did in Soviet times?
Well, I think we can absolutely do more, but I would caution you against thinking that it's going to have that significant of an effect because, look at Russia. Russian mothers and fathers don't want their kids to die for Ukraine either, and yet you're not seeing major protests. You're not seeing a lot of civil disobedience against conscription and mobilization, and Russia, while an authoritarian society, is not even close in its control of the population compared to China. So our ability to, get a popular uprising of some sort, I think, is quite limited, and I'm dubious about its potential for success.
Okay, let's take one more from over here. In the middle of the side, you could, right there. Yeah, you. Yep.
Hi, thank you. My question is, if China does decide to invade Taiwan, what do you foresee will be the reaction of the US's allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific? And if they are reluctant to engage in the conflict, do you see the US going it alone?
I don't think we can go it alone from practical perspective. I mean, at a minimum, we're going to need Japanese air bases, at a minimum. We've just struck an accord with the Philippines or about to get access to their bases, but unclear under what conditions, and if the Philippines government would allow us to use them in the case of war against China. I think Korea will most likely stay out of it and will not allow us to launch strikes against the mainland from their bases. So I think it's going to be a mixed bag. Australia is going to be with us. New Zealand, probably not. Japan, I think, is moving in this direction, and they certainly view Taiwan as being vital to their security interests. A lot depends also on what China does, right? So I think because of how Russia launched this war against Ukraine, because of the brutality that they're demonstrating, the tortures in Bucha and elsewhere, et cetera, they've turned a lot of people against them that they probably could have kept neutral at a minimum, if not on their side. And depending on how China does it, if they try to starve the population with a blockade, for example, they're going to make it much worse for themselves. It depends on how brutal they're going to be in their tactics. Are there going to be pictures on television of dead babies in Taiwan because they're striking, hospitals or school facilities, etc. So all of that is going to have a big impact on how much pressure those countries are going to come under to help us out, at least with basing, if not joining in.
Well, an incredibly rich and important conversation, because as you suggest, this is not just an abstract or theoretical possibility. So I want you to join me in thanking Dmitri for taking the time and for his great contributions to SAIS.